hatred makes people blind. That night, it blinded 5 men to the quiet power sitting in that corner booth. They saw what they wanted to see: a black man alone in their territory, an easy target in their small-town diner. What they missed were the signs, the way his eyes tracked every movement, how his shoulders held that perfect military posture, the dangerous stillness in his hands. They were so busy playing predator, they never realized they were challenging a lion. By the time the badge came out, by the time they understood who Officer Marcus Thompson really was, their lesson had already begun. The fluorescent lights of Pete's diner buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow across the worn linoleum floor. It was that awkward hour between dinner and midnight when the world seems to pause, when the decent folks are home in bed and the troublemakers are just getting started. Officer Marcus Thompson sat in his usual corner booth, civilian clothes hiding the badge he'd worn proudly for the past 12 years. His coffee had grown cold, but he barely noticed, his trained eyes catching every detail of the scene unfolding around him. The bell above the door chimed, sharp and clear in the quiet diner. 5 men swaggered in, radiating trouble like heat from summer asphalt. Their boots scuffed against the floor, leather jackets creaking as they moved. Confederate flag patches adorned their vests, a statement of intention rather than heritage. The leader, a tall man with a shaved head and eyes like burned glass, scanned the diner before his gaze locked onto Marcus. Sarah, the waitress who'd served this diner for 20 years, tensed behind the counter. Her hand clutched her order pad a little tighter, knuckles white against the green vinyl. She'd seen trouble before, but something about tonight felt different. The air seemed to crackle with unspoken tension. Well, the leader drawled, his voice carrying across the diner like oil on water. Looks like someone's lost their way. His followers snickered, spreading out like wolves preparing to circle their prey. Marcus didn't react. He'd faced worse in his years on the force, dealt with hatred wrapped in 100 different disguises. He took another sip of his cold coffee, movements deliberate and unhurried. The diner had gone silent except for the soft clink of his cup against the saucer and the persistent hum of the fluorescent lights. The other patrons, an elderly couple sharing pie, a trucker hunched over his burger, and 2 college students with their laptops, tried to make themselves invisible. They'd seen this script play out before in small towns across America. Nobody wanted to get involved, but nobody could look away either. "Hey, boy," the leader called out, emphasizing the word like a weapon. "Don't you know this ain't your kind of place?" Marcus set his cup down slowly, studying the dark liquid as if it held answers to questions nobody had asked yet. His mind flashed briefly to the community outreach meeting he'd led that morning, teaching kids about conflict resolution. The irony wasn't lost on him. Sarah moved toward his table, coffee pot trembling slightly in her hand. "Can I get you anything else?" she asked quietly, her eyes pleading with him to leave before things got ugly. Marcus gave her a gentle smile, the same one he used to calm victims during difficult calls. "Just the check, Sarah." "Thank you." The leader's face darkened at the familiarity, at the calm in Marcus's voice. He stepped closer, his boots heavy against the floor. "You deaf or something?" "We're talking to you." Marcus finally looked up, his eyes meeting the leader's with a steadiness that seemed to catch the man off guard. There was no fear in that gaze, no anger, just a patient assessment that made the leader shift uncomfortably without knowing why. "I heard you just fine," Marcus replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone used to being listened to. "I'm just choosing not to engage." The words hung in the air like smoke, heavy with meaning. The leader's followers exchanged glances, uncertain now. This wasn't going according to their usual script. Their target wasn't cowering, wasn't running, wasn't giving them the reaction they craved. Outside, a police cruiser rolled past the diner, its lights off but its presence noted. None of them knew it was Marcus's partner, doing his usual drive-by check. The coincidence would have been funny if the situation weren't so charged with potential violence. The leader leaned forward, placing his hands on Marcus's table, invading his space with deliberate menace. "Maybe we need to teach you some manners, show you how things work around here." Marcus remained still, but something shifted in his posture, subtle as a shadow moving across water. Years of training, countless confrontations, and a deep understanding of human nature had taught him to recognize the moment when words alone wouldn't be enough. He tried to avoid this, but some lessons could only be learned the hard way. The diner's ancient ceiling fan spun lazily overhead, pushing around air that had grown thick with tension. Behind the counter, the short-order cook, Eddie, had stopped flipping burgers, his spatula frozen mid-air as he watched the scene unfold. The sizzle of the grill provided an odd soundtrack to the mounting confrontation. The leader, who Marcus had overheard being called Rick, drummed his fingers on the table's laminate surface. Each tap echoed like a countdown to something inevitable. His followers had positioned themselves strategically, 2 by the door, 2 flanking their leader. It was the kind of formation Marcus had seen countless times on the force, though usually from the other side of the law. "You know what your problem is?" Rick sneered, leaning closer. The fluorescent lights caught the edges of a faded prison tattoo on his neck. "You people think you can just walk in anywhere these days. Think you're entitled to sit wherever you want, eat wherever you want." Marcus took another sip of his coffee, his movements smooth and controlled. 12 years on the force had taught him that silence could be more powerful than words. He'd learned that lesson his first year as a rookie, watching his training officer defuse a hostile situation with nothing but calm patience and steady eyes. "Nothing to say," one of Rick's followers called out. He was younger than the others, probably in his early 20s, with a nervous energy that made him dangerous. "Cat got your tongue, boy?" The racist slurs hung in the air like poison. Sarah, the waitress, had retreated behind the counter, but her hand was inching toward the phone. Marcus caught her eye and gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. Not yet. He'd seen too many situations like this escalate because someone called too soon, before he had control of the scene. "You've got 2 choices here," Marcus said finally, his voice carrying that same quiet authority that had calmed riot situations and talked down armed suspects. "You can walk away now, enjoy your evening somewhere else, or you can make choices you'll regret tomorrow." His words caused a ripple of unease among Rick's followers. They weren't used to this kind of response. Their usual targets showed fear, anger, or both. This calm certainty was something new, something that didn't fit their script. Rick's face flushed red. "Is that a threat?" he demanded, slamming his palm flat against the table. Coffee sloshed over the rim of Marcus's cup, creating a dark constellation of droplets on the white surface. "No," Marcus replied, dabbing at the spill with a napkin. "Just experience talking." That word, experience, seemed to hover in the air. One of Rick's men, a heavily tattooed man with a graying beard, shifted uncomfortably. He'd been studying Marcus's movements, the way he controlled his space, the practiced ease of his posture. Recognition flickered in his eyes. He'd seen that kind of bearing before, in men you didn't want to underestimate. "Boss," the tattooed man started, but Rick cut him off with a glare. "Shut it, Dale." Rick turned back to Marcus, his lip curled in a snarl. "You don't get to come in here, acting all high and mighty. This ain't your territory." Marcus aligned his empty coffee cup perfectly with its saucer, the small action drawing all eyes. There was something hypnotic about his precision, the deliberate nature of every movement. The college students at the far booth had their phones out now, recording discreetly. They knew they were about to witness something, though they weren't sure what. "Territory," Marcus repeated the word thoughtfully. "Interesting choice of words. Tell me something, how long have you lived in this town?" The question caught Rick off guard. "Born and raised," he spat. "Unlike some people." Marcus nodded slowly. 17 years for me. Bought my house on Maple Street back when old Mr. Henderson was selling his properties. Know his grandson Tommy? I coached his little league team last summer." The local reference landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through the diner. The elderly couple exchanged glances. Everyone knew Tommy Henderson. The boy had hit his first home run under Marcus's coaching, a story that had made the local paper. "You're lying," Rick said, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his voice. "Check the team photo on the wall behind you," Marcus said quietly. Every head turned. There, among the local sports memorabilia and faded newspaper clippings that decorated Pete's diner, was a photo from last summer. And there was Marcus, in a coaching cap and jersey, surrounded by grinning kids of all races, Tommy Henderson front and center with a trophy. The moment stretched like pulled taffy. Rick's followers looked increasingly uncertain, but their leader had gone too far to back down now. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, knuckles white with rage. "I don't care if you're Jesus Christ himself," Rick snarled. "You're leaving this diner. One way or another." Marcus pushed his coffee cup aside and folded his hands on the table. The movement was calm, but something had changed in his eyes. The professional patience was still there, but beneath it now was something harder, something forged in the heat of 1,000 similar confrontations. "No," he said simply. "I'm not." Rick's face contorted with rage at Marcus's simple refusal. The air in the diner crackled with electricity, like the moment before a storm breaks. The young nervous one had started to bounce on his feet, eager for action, while Dale, the tattooed man with the gray beard, took a small step backward, his instincts screaming warnings he couldn't quite understand. "Last chance," Rick growled, leaning forward until his face was inches from Marcus's. "Get out." Marcus didn't lean back, didn't flinch. His breathing remained steady, measured, the same rhythm he'd used during countless high-stakes operations. In his mind, he was already mapping the space, calculating angles, remembering the locations of every patron who might get caught in the crossfire of what was coming. "You know what's interesting?" Marcus said, his voice carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent diner. "In 12 years of serving this community, I've learned something important. The loudest threats usually come from the weakest men." Everything happened at once. Rick's fist shot forward, a wild haymaker fueled by wounded pride and blind hatred. But where Marcus had been sitting a split second before, there was only empty air. He had shifted, smooth as water, his years of training transforming into pure fluid motion. The punch met nothing but the empty booth cushion as Marcus stood in one seamless movement. His hand caught Rick's extended arm, and suddenly the larger man was off balance, stumbling forward. The momentum that was meant to hurt Marcus now worked against its owner. "Don't," Marcus said quietly, but it wasn't the word that made everyone freeze, it was the authority behind it, the kind that came from years of commanding respect on the streets. The young one, high on adrenaline and poor choices, didn't listen. He charged forward, switchblade appearing in his hand like a magic trick. The blade caught the fluorescent light, drawing a gasp from Sarah behind the counter. Marcus moved with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times. His grip on Rick's arm shifted, and suddenly the leader was between Marcus and the knife, a human shield. The young attacker pulled up short, blade wavering. "Real smart," Marcus commented, his voice still calm. "Bringing a knife to what was just a conversation. That's a felony charge right there." The word felony hit the air like a thunderclap. Dale, the tattooed man, grabbed the young one's arm. "Put it away, Jimmy," he ordered, his voice rough with sudden understanding. "Put it away now." But Rick wasn't done. He tried to wrench free, throwing an elbow back toward Marcus's face. It was like trying to hit smoke. Marcus redirected the movement, using Rick's own force against him, and suddenly the proud leader of the group was face down on the checkered floor, arm locked behind his back. Marcus had him pinned with what looked like minimal effort, one knee placed precisely to control without causing undue pain. It was the kind of hold taught in police academies, perfected through years of practical application. "Stay down," Marcus advised, his tone almost conversational. "You're already looking at assault charges. Don't make it worse." "Who the hell are you?" Rick spat, his face pressed against the cold linoleum. That's when Marcus reached into his back pocket with his free hand, movements careful and deliberate. The badge caught the diner's lights as he placed it where Rick could see it. "Officer Marcus Thompson," he said clearly, his voice carrying to every corner of the now silent diner. "Badge number 4427. And you just assaulted a police officer." The reaction rippled through the diner like a shock wave. Dale cursed under his breath, already backing toward the door. Jimmy's knife clattered to the floor, his young face draining of color. The other two stood frozen, their world crumbling around them as they realized just how badly they had miscalculated. But it was the change in Rick that was most dramatic. All the fight drained out of him in an instant, replaced by the cold realization of just how completely he had destroyed his own life in the span of a few mindless minutes. "Officer," he started, but Marcus cut him off. "Save it," he said, his voice professional now, all pretense dropped. "You've got the right to remain silent. I suggest you use it." The diner had become a stage, and every person in it knew they were witnessing something they'd be talking about for years to come. Sarah's hand finally found the phone, but instead of calling 911, she was recording, just like the college students, just like the trucker who'd abandoned his burger. Some stories needed to be documented. These are the moments that change perspectives. The moments that remind us why we need to see the whole story. Subscribe now and join thousands of others who understand that the most powerful stories are the ones that make us think differently. Marcus maintained his hold on Rick, professional to the core, but his attention never left the other four men. Dale, the tattooed veteran, had become an unexpected ally, using his bulk to keep Jimmy and the others from making another mistake. "On your knees, hands where I can see them," Marcus commanded, his voice carrying that unmistakable authority that pulled compliance from even the most resistant subjects. The three men closest to him compiled immediately, their earlier bravado evaporating like morning dew. Only Jimmy remained standing, trembling near the door, caught between fight and flight. His eyes darted to his fallen knife, then to the exit. "Don't," Dale growled at him. "You're already in deep enough, kid." The wail of approaching sirens filtered through the diner's windows. Marcus's partner had seen enough during his drive-by to call for backup. The sound seemed to wake something in Rick, still pinned to the floor. "You don't understand," he said, his voice muffled against the linoleum. "You don't know what it's like here. This is our town." Marcus adjusted his hold, maintaining control while leaning closer to speak. "I want you to look around this diner," he said, his voice low but carrying. "Really look. See that elderly couple? The Wilsons. Mr. Wilson taught math at the high school for 40 years. Taught your kids, probably. That trucker? Stops here every week, brings supplies that keep our stores stocked. Those college students? They'll graduate, maybe stay, maybe go, but right now they're part of this community too." He paused, letting his words sink in. "And me? I've broken up domestic disputes here, talked kids out of making permanent mistakes, helped old ladies change flat tires in the rain. So tell me again, whose town is this?" The front door burst open, three officers rushing in with hands on their weapons. They froze for a split second, taking in the scene, their fellow officer, still in civilian clothes, controlling a suspect while four more knelt nearby, the scattered audience watching with phones raised. "Nice of you to join us, Miller," Marcus called to his partner, who was already moving to secure the other suspects. "Watch the one by the door. He's got a knife on the floor near his feet." The next few minutes were a blur of activity. Rights were read, handcuffs clicked, and one by one, the five men who'd entered the diner looking for trouble were led out to waiting patrol cars. The red and blue lights painted the parking lot in alternating colors, drawing a small crowd of onlookers. Sarah approached Marcus as he finished giving his statement to another officer. Her hands were shaking slightly, but her eyes were clear. "All these years," she said softly. "All these years you've been coming in here, and I never knew." Marcus smiled, the same gentle smile he'd given her earlier. "That was kind of the point, Sarah. Sometimes the best way to serve the community is to just be part of it." Eddie, the cook, had come out from behind his grill. He was holding something in his hands, an old photograph, slightly yellowed with age. "Found this in the back," he said, holding it out. "From the day you helped us rebuild after the tornado. Never made the connection until now." The photo showed a younger Marcus, in uniform then, helping to clear debris from the diner's parking lot. Behind him, community members worked together, passing supplies, rebuilding what nature had tried to destroy. I remember that day, Marcus said, taking the photo carefully. Whole town came together. Didn't matter who you were or where you came from. We were just people. Neighbors. The college students had approached cautiously, phones still in hand. Officer Thompson, one of them asked. What you did tonight, the way you handled it, would you mind if we shared our videos? People need to see this. Marcus looked at the young faces, saw the hope there, the desire to be part of something meaningful. He thought about all the times he'd had to make split-second decisions, all the moments that could have gone differently if he'd let anger or fear take control. Share it, he said finally. But make sure you tell the whole story. Not just the takedown, not just the badge reveal. Tell them about Tommy Henderson's baseball team. Tell them about the tornado. Tell them about a community that's bigger than any one group's hatred. The next morning, Pete's diner looked the same as it always had. The neon sign still buzzed, the coffee still percolated, and Sarah still wiped down the counter with practiced strokes. But something had shifted, like a photograph tilted ever so slightly on a wall, small enough that you might miss it, but impossible to unsee once you noticed. The breakfast regulars had already heard the story. News travels fast in small towns, carried on whispers and text messages, shared over morning coffee and early shifts. They came in waves, not just for the food but for the chance to sit in the booth where it happened, to hear the story firsthand from Sarah or Eddie. Marcus walked in at his usual time, 7:15 a.m., still in his civilian clothes. He was due at the station in an hour, but some routines didn't change, badge or no badge. The diner fell quiet as he entered, but it wasn't the tense silence of the night before. This was different, expectant, respectful. Your usual, Officer Thompson? Sarah asked, emphasizing his title with a small smile. Just Marcus, Sarah, he replied, sliding into his regular booth. Nothing's changed. But things had changed. The local paper's editor was already at the counter, nursing his third coffee. The college students' videos had gone viral overnight, spreading across social media like wildfire. The story was being picked up by larger news outlets, hungry for something that cut through the usual noise of hatred and division. Mind if I join you? The voice belonged to Dale, the tattooed man from the night before. He stood there awkwardly, looking smaller somehow without his leather vest, without his crowd of followers. He'd been released on his own recognizance, having been the only one who tried to de-escalate at the end. Marcus gestured to the seat across from him. Dale sat down heavily, his hands wrapped around a coffee cup like it was keeping him anchored to earth. My old man was a cop, Dale said finally, staring into his coffee. 20 years on the force in Chicago. He used to tell me stories about keeping your cool when everything around you was chaos. Never really understood what he meant until last night. Marcus listened, letting the silence do its work. Sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was just let someone talk. I served too, you know, Dale continued. Marines. 2 tours. Should have known better than to run with Rick's crowd. Should have recognized that stillness in you. That control. He looked up finally, meeting Marcus's eyes. You could have hurt us bad last night. Would have been justified, especially after Jimmy pulled the knife. But you didn't. Force should be the last resort, Marcus replied quietly, not the first instinct. Something else I bet your father taught you. Dale nodded, his throat working. I've got a son, he said suddenly. 14. He saw the video last night. Called me crying. Asked me what the hell I was doing there, running with those guys. He swallowed hard. I didn't have an answer for him. The morning sun had crept higher, streaming through the diner's windows, catching the dust motes in the air. They danced like tiny stars, reminding Marcus of all the small moments that make up a life, the choices, the changes, the chances to be better. What are you going to tell him? Marcus asked. Dale was quiet for a long moment. The truth, he said finally. That I lost my way for a while. That I forgot what it means to serve something bigger than yourself. that sometimes it takes seeing real strength, real control, to remember who you're supposed to be. The story of that night at Pete's Diner spread far beyond the town limits, carried on waves of social media and word of mouth. But it wasn't just the takedown that people talked about, or the dramatic reveal of the badge. It was the smaller moments that stuck with them, the careful control, the community connections, the choice to protect even those who meant harm. A week later, Marcus sat in his patrol car, parked across from the local high school. He watched as students streamed out of the building, their faces bright with youth and possibility. Among them was Dale's son, walking tall, no longer ashamed of his father's viral video moment. The boy caught sight of Marcus and gave a small wave, a gesture of respect, of understanding. Rick and his crew faced their charges in court, but that wasn't the end of their story. Jimmy, the youngest, enrolled in a community rehabilitation program, guided by none other than Dale, who'd found his way back to serving others. Sometimes the strongest changes come from the hardest falls. The college students' videos had sparked conversations across the country. Not just about police training or racial tensions, but about something deeper, the quiet strength it takes to remain calm in the face of hatred, the power of knowing your community, and the importance of seeing people as people first. Stories like these remind us that heroes don't always wear capes or uniforms. Sometimes they sit quietly in diners, drinking cold coffee, choosing peace until peace is no longer an option. They walk among us every day, carrying badges not just on their belts, but in their hearts, in their commitment to protect and serve, even those who hate them. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about strength, about service, about what it means to be part of a community, then share it. Let others see that real power isn't in hatred or fear, it's in the control we choose to maintain, the connections we choose to build, and the humanity we choose to see in each other. 6 months later, Pete's Diner looked much the same, the checkered floor still squeaked under boots, the coffee still needed sugar, and Sarah still served with a smile. But there was something new on the wall beside Tommy Henderson's baseball photo. A framed news article, its headline reading, "Local Officer Shows True Meaning of Protect and Serve." Below the article was a quote, words Marcus had spoken that night that became a sort of unofficial motto for the town: "The strongest people aren't the ones who never face hatred, they're the ones who face it without becoming what they fight against." Marcus still came in for coffee every morning, still sat in his regular booth. But now, more often than not, someone would join him, a teenager needing advice, a fellow officer seeking guidance, or just a community member wanting to share a story. That corner booth had become more than just a seat in a diner, it had become a symbol of what's possible when strength meets wisdom, when service meets understanding. Every day, across this country, there are people like Marcus, officers, teachers, neighbors, friends, who choose the harder path. They choose to stay calm when others rage, to protect even those who would harm them, to serve communities that sometimes forget they're there. These are the stories we need to share. These are the moments that remind us who we can be. If this story touched you, if it made you believe in the power of quiet strength and true service, then join us. Subscribe to see more real stories of everyday heroes who walk among us. Because in times like these, we need reminders that the best kind of power isn't in destruction, it's in the strength to stay true to who you are, even when the world tests you. Remember Officer Marcus Thompson. Remember that night in Pete's Diner. But most of all, remember that sometimes the wrong target turns out to be exactly the right person to teach us all a lesson about what real strength looks like. Share this story. Let it remind others that in a world that often feels divided, there are still people who stand in the gap, who protect without prejudice, who serve without seeking glory. Because these stories? They're not just about one night or one officer or one small-town diner. They're about all of us, and the choice we make every day about what kind of people we want to be. 1 year later, a young police academy recruit stood before her class, giving a presentation on de-escalation techniques. On the screen behind her was a still image from that night at Pete's Diner, Marcus, calm and controlled, even in the midst of chaos. "Officer Thompson taught us something that night," she said, her voice clear and confident. "Something that goes beyond badges and uniforms, beyond any one profession or calling. He showed us that true power isn't in how hard you can hit, it's in knowing when not to. The academy classroom was silent, every face turned toward the screen, every mind processing what they saw. Among them sat Jimmy, the young man who'd pulled a knife that night. He was in training now too, his life transformed by the very man he'd once tried to harm. The stories continued to spread, each telling adding another layer of understanding. But it wasn't just a story about police work, or racial tension, or small-town America. It was something more universal, something that touched the core of what it means to be human. Here's what we learned that night at Pete's Diner. Real strength isn't measured by how loud you can shout, but by how steady you can stand in the face of hatred. It's not about the power you have, but the power you choose not to use. It's about understanding that every moment of conflict is a choice to escalate or de-escalate, to harm or to help, to divide or unite. The hardest battles aren't fought with fists or words. They're fought in the quiet moments when we choose who we want to be. They're won in the seconds between action and reaction, in the space between what's easy and what's right. And perhaps most importantly, we learn that the people we're quickest to judge might be the very ones who teach us our most valuable lessons. That the target of our hatred might turn out to be the mirror that shows us who we really are. If this story moved you, if it made you think twice about judgment, about strength, about what real power looks like, then share it. Let it remind others that in a world quick to divide us into categories, black and white, cop and civilian, us and them, there's a deeper truth. We're all part of the same community, all capable of both prejudice and understanding, all able to choose what kind of person we want to be. Because in the end, that's what this story is really about. Not just one night in a diner, not just one officer who stayed calm in the face of hatred, not just 5 men who learned the hard way that appearances can deceive. It's about the choice we all face, every single day. The choice to be better than our prejudices. The choice to find strength and restraint. The choice to protect even those who would harm us. The choice to see the humanity in everyone, even when they can't see it in us. Remember Officer Marcus Thompson. Remember Pete's Diner. But most of all, remember this. The strongest people aren't the ones who never face hatred, they're the ones who face it without becoming what they fight against. And sometimes, the wrong target turns out to be exactly the right person to remind us all of who we can be when we choose wisdom over anger, understanding over prejudice, and quiet strength over loud hatred. Share this story if you believe in the power of these choices. Subscribe to see more stories that remind us what real strength looks like. Because in times like these, we need these reminders more than ever. The hardest battles are won in silence, and the greatest victories often go unseen. But their impact? That echoes forever in the lives we touch and the changes we inspire. Choose wisely. Choose strength. Choose to be the person who makes others think twice about their prejudices. Because you never know, you might just be someone's wrong target too.